very loud. Hello everyone. Now, in my little head, I'd like to think that was applause for me, but I know I am not worthy. I work for the libraries in Northampton and... Oh, thank you. Doesn't normally get that reaction. Now I'm going to cry. So I've come on here to thank all of you for donating a graphic novel that is going to go into one of our 36 libraries and be matched. So I've looked at the quality of the things that have been donated and it's just amazing. So thank you, all of you. We're going to get lots of young people coming into libraries to read those, because I know I'm youth librarian, and one of the things people say is we don't have enough graphic novels. I don't have enough money personally to buy them. But you all have, so thank you very much for that. And I just want to thank and introduce this gentleman who needs no introduction, and thank you, Alan, for agreeing to come and support the library services and to do this. Thanks.
You're too kind. And I want to echo what Ruth just said. Thanks ever so much for coming along here and supporting the libraries and bringing all these books. That's fantastic. You know. Before I go any further, there's an important piece on the agenda. There's a young lady over here today from Australia. She's a roller derby queen. Her name is Wendy, and I believe she's known by the sobriquet of Smash and Stitch. Where are you, Wendy? Are you?
Over.
Ah, there you are. Well, a very, very happy birthday, Wendy. And could all of us here just give Wendy a day to remember by, even if it's like when she's in her 80s or something and she's confused, she can wake up and think, oh my God, I was once shouted at by a couple of hundred people in a big room. So on three, happy birthday, Wendy. 1, 2, 3.
Happy birthday, Wendy!
Thank you!
Right, now, some of the few people out there who are closer to my own age, which is to say, like, nearly dead, to all practical intents and purposes, but you might remember that the last time that I attended a comic-related event was 22 years ago, something like that. So obviously a lot of you will not remember that. But the reason I'm here today is not primarily to do with comics. Primarily it's to do with the libraries, because I am a huge supporter of the library system. Perhaps less of a supporter of the comics industry, at least these days. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, well, basically ramble pointlessly, I think is the correct expression, for about the next hour. I'm going to be talking about, I will be talking about writing, and I will be talking about writing comics. I shall also be talking first about reading, which is really, really important if you want to progress to actually writing. So when it gets to be about 7 o'clock, if I've gone into a fugue state and I'm just sort of staring into space and just reciting a list of adjectives or something and nobody understands it, can somebody just give me a shout when it gets to 7 o'clock, and then we can throw this open and we'll do a question and answer session, and in which you can ask me pretty much anything you want. I mean, at your own risk, anything you want. Okay, so let's take this back to the beginning, or at least for me, the beginning. I was born in, 1953. This was like back in the Cretaceous period. We had dinosaurs living next door to us. They were such nice people. I remember that in the neighbourhood that I grew up in, it was the Boroughs in Northampton. Back in around 800 AD, King Alfred the Great had said that it was foremost amongst the shires. So that meant it was the capital. These days it is pretty much a red light district. So it has kind of gone downhill a bit. But I still prefer to think, I mean, King Alfred, you've kind of got to respect the guy. I mean, he's one of the only English monarchs who's called the Great. You know, so I say that, in my head at least, Northampton, and specifically the Boroughs, the area that I was born in, that is still an alternate world capital of Great Britain. In the area, when I was growing up, illiteracy was a problem. It was something to be ashamed of, or at least back then, and my parents, who could read and write, were very concerned that I should learn at least the rudiments of reading and writing as early as possible. I think that is still borne out by scientific research today that says that if you teach a child language skills early enough, then their future education is pretty much assured. That's the key to learning and understanding everything else. So, I wasn't reading fluently when I was 4. Didn't read a lot of Proust. Very little Dostoevsky. You know. Old Lob and his farmyard friends, on the other hand, I was well acquainted with. And when I was 5, I remember that the headmistress at the school actually pointed out that at the age of 5 you could join the library, which was brilliant, because I think we had about 4 or 5 books in our house. Most of these, and I'm not trying to get all Dickensian here or claim sympathy, but most of these were ones that had been given to my dad by charitable institutions, who every Christmas would go around and hand out books to the poor families in the boroughs. One of them was a golden encyclopedia for boys, which, if it was the only book you got to read, you could sort of dip into it briefly, you know. But I think there was a copy of The Carpetbaggers by Harold Robbins that always fell open at page 112 for older readers. So there wasn't a lot of literary stimulation. But when I got to the library, I really couldn't believe it. There was all of these books, and they were like free, or at the very worst, if you were a real transgressor and kept them for a couple of weeks, you were fined like a penny. And I mean, I would never go that long myself. I saved a lot of money in library fines by getting my mother to take me there about 3 times a week. And I'd get 2 or 3 books out and I'd have read them within a few days. It was fantastic. Everything was available to you and was available to everybody. I suppose you could say that the internet should be fulfilling that capability in the present day, but it's largely about pornography, isn't it? I mean, let's be frank, we're amongst friends here. That's largely what it's for. Or at least I have my doubts that it is conveying information efficiently to all the people who need it. I think that libraries are still the best bet. So, like back then, I was reading, it was largely kind of fantastic stories. Anything that had got the word magic in the title. Books of Greek legends, Norse legends, the children's book of Arthurian legends, children's book of Robin Hood, children's book of Hereward the Wake. That's a name that you don't hear very often these days, but when I was growing up, he was right up there with Robin Hood. He was basically an anti-Norman terrorist in the 11th century, which perhaps explains why he's no longer allowed to be a popular children's favourite, much in the same way as the gunpowder plotters. I remember that when we were planning V for Vendetta, and David Lloyd had the idea of using the Guy Fawkes mask, he'd gone out hoping to buy one, only to find that that was the very year that they'd suddenly stopped making them, and they'd stopped calling it Guy Fawkes Night. It was now Bonfire Night, and if you were lucky you could get a plastic Frankenstein mask for Halloween, you know. Yeah, like I say, these people have since been more or less removed from history books, you know, for whatever reason. So I was going to the library, I was taking out all these books, and then at one point I remember there used to be a market stall in the middle of the Northampton marketplace that was called Sid's, by the owner. Unsurprisingly, that was his name. He wore a muffler and a cap, smoked a pipe, and I remember that they used to have all of these comics on the front section of the stall. There'd be, this was about 1959, 1960, something like that. So there'd be the very first few, there'd be the DC comics of that period, Superman, Batman. I think my first comic was a copy of The Flash. And this was incredible. I mean, I was already reading British comics, which, looking back, were wonderful. They were a lot better than I gave them credit for being at the time. It was, yeah, the work by Leo Baxendale or Davy Law or Ken Reed. This was fantastic. It was as good as anything that was being done in America, but the subject matter was largely children from working class backgrounds whose parents seemed to have an unusual fondness for corporal punishment. The end of every script would be Dennis the Menace or Minnie the Minx being hit with a slipper. I presumed that this was a kind of comedy that probably worked better in Dundee, where the books were actually published, than it was going down in Northampton. But this was basically just normal life. Whereas, not being hit by a slipper, that wasn't normal in any town, I'm sure. But the situations, they were realistic, ordinary situations that you could just about imagine you or your friends getting into. So the American comics, when I saw them, were very different. They were in full colour, and they've got these fantastic, brightly costumed characters on the front. And yeah, I was an early adapter. Now, back then, it was an special badge of freakishness to actually read American comics, because nobody else did. Everybody else read comics about either war or football, generally, and they tended to think that you was a bit odd if you were reading superhero comics. And I must say that in later life I've perhaps come to sympathise with their position to a certain degree, you know. But back then, the superhero comics that I was reading, they were being written for children. And they were being written by professional writers. People like Gardner Fox, John Broome. I didn't know this at the time. But most of these people, they were people who'd been pulp writers. And comics were just one of the things that they did. And they did them as well as they could. But they weren't comic fans. They were practical, grown-up individuals who were making a living by doing the best stuff that they were capable of. And sometimes that was really, really good stuff. People like Gardner Fox, who was one of the first writers that I ever heard of. Gardner Fox had written hundreds of pulp stories. My great friend and mentor, Steve Moore, no relation, which is what he's going to have on his tombstone under his name, no relation. But sort of, he's got a massive collection of Gardner Fox paperbacks, his spy stories, his western stories, his historical fictions, his sex books, his all sorts of things, his comedies. This guy was probably writing a book every couple of weeks. I'm not going to vouch for the quality of the material. Probably a lot of it would be considered pulpy or ropey. But he certainly knew how to write and he knew how to have ideas. And he wasn't the only one employed in the comics industry back then. So all of the characters that I was reading about, it was wonderful. It was exactly like the books of mythology for young people that I was already reading. But these were available monthly or semi-monthly. Back then, comic books only came into this country as ballast in the holds of ships. So you'd frequently get issues missing, things that simply didn't appear. I can remember that in the comic catalogues of my teenage years, if you should ever find a comic price guide from back then, an English one, you will find that Tales to Astonish 62 is ridiculously highly priced. It's not because it was any good, it's just that it never came over here. So the laws of supply and demand being what they were, that meant that you could only get it for an extortionate amount. And thankfully I never actually did buy that issue because it really was rubbish. Yeah, this was my early exposure to comics. It was a wonderland of the imagination. Superheroes were symbols of the imagination. They opened up all these doors in your head. They weren't in any way grim figures. Batman, far from being the Dark Knight, he was like, I don't know, your uncle. If your uncle did like to dress up as a bat in the evenings. I mean, we've all had uncles like that, haven't we? But yeah, he was always smiling, he was always going around in the daylight. He'd got a dog that wore a mask. I mean, how impossibly brilliant is that? I mean, why did he wear the mask? Was it so that the other dogs wouldn't replicate it? Fantastic. I loved all that stuff. I loved Batmite. I loved the ever-increasing Batman family. You know, there'd be pets, there'd be junior sidekicks, there'd be a Batwoman, a Batgirl. It was fantastic. The Batman Annual, which would tell you all of the secrets of the Batcave, or secrets of the utility belt. I loved that. I was 8, you know. And as I got older, there were more comics available. I mean, I was there when Marvel Comics switched up. It wasn't even called Marvel Comics. It didn't seem to have a name. It was basically mystery books with big monsters in them, usually drawn by Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko. Wonderful things. But they seemed to suddenly shift and suddenly started producing these odd little superhero titles. And I can remember that what I'd do when I visited the market stall and there were all these comics held down by big round lead paperweights, and then there'd be the magazines hanging higher up from bulldog clips, which would all be things like true men's sweat adventures and things like that. They'd usually, it seemed to suggest from the covers that for Americans, most of the Second World War was spent being tormented by underwear models with swastika armbands. That wasn't my dad's experience of it, but I presume it was different over there, you know. And so yeah, there'd be all of these comics, and I would buy all the ones that had superheroes in them, or get my mum to buy them, you know, if the truth's to be told. And you'd kind of get through your favourites quite early on, and then you'd be down, by the end of the month, you'd be down to like a copy of Black Hawk that you'd already looked at 6 times and thought, nah, you know. But I was ill in bed. My mum said, shall I get you a comic? And I said, remembering this one copy of Black Hawk that I'd already said, nah, to about 6 times. I said, yeah, there's this one comic, it's got all these people in blue costumes. So she went out and she came back with Fantastic Four #3, which was the first time that I'd ever seen Jack Kirby's art. No, I'd seen his work in the mystery books. I probably didn't recognise the name, but I think seeing that particular issue of the Fantastic Four, it was completely different to the DC comics that I was reading. They were somehow more genteel. Most of their heroes seemed to be wealthy playboys. They were a bit better off than the early Marvel Comics heroes used to seem to be. I mean, Jack Kirby would delight in setting a lot of the stories in the tenement neighbourhoods that he grew up in. So you'd get this real texture of ordinary people's lives, even though there was all this superhero stuff going on in the foreground. And yeah, that was really addictive. And for the next few years, I was probably more of a Marvel fan than a DC fan, but I was pretty promiscuous when it came down to it, you know, sort of. I wouldn't commit to either company. But yeah, you know, this probably carried on until my early teenage years, when I was starting to feel, I will admit, a little bit uncomfortable about reading superhero comics, because, you know, when you're 14, things change. It's like you suddenly realise that the personality that's got you through the first 13 or 14 years of your life perfectly reasonably is not going to work when it comes to, I don't know, meeting the opposite sex, or, you know, that you get it's a kind of an intuition. You think, yeah, girls are not that interested in Green Lantern, are they? You know, and for any of you who haven't had that intuition yet, that is actually true. And so sort of, yeah, you know, like I was, around the age of 14, I was starting to feel a bit uneasy about the superhero thing. But I was still fascinated by comics. And there were some incredible comics starting to come out around then. Only in dribs and drabs, but I mean, Jim Steranko was doing the Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. strip, which was psychedelic. He was taking influences from things like the San Francisco underground poster artists, from op artists and surrealists, things that had never been seen before in ordinary standard superhero comics. There was also, I think, Harvey Comics, home of Casper the Friendly Ghost. They published an issue of Will Eisner's The Spirit in 1967. It was, I think they published a couple of issues of it, and it was reprinting older Eisner Spirit stories. And I read that, and it was like a huge light bulb suddenly going on in my head. I suddenly realised that actually this was what I loved about comics. It was the way that you could tell a story just using comics. And Eisner, he was genuinely a master. Sometimes his actual stories, by today's standards, might be seen as a bit schmaltzy, something like that. But the way he told them cannot be faulted. He would do things with the page layouts. He would tell wonderful, eccentric little stories. Adolf Hitler suddenly deciding to come to America to see why everybody hates him, and wandering around in a Jewish neighbourhood in the Bronx. A little 4 or 5 page story. There was another story about Gerhard Schnabel. He has some great names for his characters, Eisner. This was a guy who, since he was a child, had been aware that he could fly. But his parents had discouraged him from this because they didn't want him to stand out from the rest of the crowd. And the story is almost not about him. He's decided that, yes, today, damn it all, I'm going to show the world that I can fly. So he's going to go up to the top of this tall building and launch himself into space. But there's some nonsense with the spirit and a bunch of gangsters going on in the background simultaneously. So when he launches himself into space, he flies, he swoops, but everybody's looking at the gunfight that is going on between the spirit and the gangsters. Until a stray bullet actually hits Gerhard Schnabel, and he plummets down to the gutters below, and nobody ever knew that he could fly. You know, it's not the best story in the world, but it was certainly a lot more inventive and witty and genuinely entertaining than a lot of the superhero stories that I've been reading. I realised that Eisner was telling stories on a different level. I also found people like Harvey Kurtzman, who was writing some incredible stuff for EC Comics. He was the genius behind the original Mad comics. And again, his storytelling in Mad and in his war books that he did, they were the most anti-war war books that you can possibly imagine. They weren't about how great it is being a tough GI. They were about how terrible it is to die for absolutely no reason at all in a foreign land. That they were wonderful. So I was starting to absorb these various influences. And I was still, and this is important, I was still going to the library, and I was still reading my way through books that I couldn't afford. And this is important, even if you are the biggest comic fan in the world, even if you are absolutely obsessed with comics, for God's sake, don't read just comics. You know, read books. Read all sorts of things, because you need that perspective. There are things that you will not find in comics that you will only find in books, and vice versa. But the important thing is to be diverse. So, it was around about, at the age of 14, there was an English comic coming out that was quite exciting at the time. I mean, basically, it was reprinting early Marvel strips in black and white. Now, I had got most of these strips, but I loved the comic because all of a sudden it was introducing these superhero strips that I quite liked to people who only read English comics. And they were really ripping off Stan Lee and the Marvel Comics publicity machine as much as possible. They called themselves Power Comics, and they got a little clenched fist in a circle. That was obviously before the Black Panther movement took up the same symbol. But they used to have, instead of Stan and Jack, like at Marvel, they'd have Alf and